My presentation today will be a meditation on the intersection of ethics, modernity, and theology in Greece and Turkey. For the purposes of this meditation, I propose a definition of modernity from the perspective of the religious and ethical disorientation caused by the emergence of novel forms of social life and political governance. In this way, modernity can be defined as a social context that demands novel forms of ethical reflection from within religious traditions on an unprecedented scale. I would argue then that modernity can be understood as having occurred in a variety of historical periods. It is the experience of having one's worldview upended by rapid social change. In our present age of modernity, as Anthony Giddens famously put it, quote, modern institutions differ from all preceding forms of social order in respect of their dynamism, their degree to which they undercut traditional habits and customs, and their global impact. This experience of an unprecedented rate of social change has had a highly variable impact based on the society in question. Slavica Jakelić's work focuses on this question as it relates to what she terms, quote, collectivistic religions, or religious traditions where membership in these communities is ascribed at birth and experienced as a fact given of one's identity. Under her definition, Orthodox Christianity and Sunni Islam in the Balkans are both collectivistic religions, and therefore their experiences of and responses to modernity can be compared along these lines. Jakelić contends that the fundamental ethical challenge faced by modern collectivistic Christianity in the Balkans is the question of religious pluralism. Quote, can Christianities that so explicitly define group boundaries partake in and contribute to the definition of public spheres defined by plurality, and if so, how? In my view, her characterization of religiosity in the modern Balkans, both Orthodox Christian and Sunni Muslim, precisely identifies the specific ethical challenges posed to both of these traditions by modernity. My meditation today will suggest possible answers to these challenges by comparatively analyzing the work of two of Greece and Turkey's most important respective modern theologians, John Zizioulas and Bekir Topaloğlu, revealing how their theological epistemologies and definitions of theology itself can lay the groundwork for ethical reflection in the context of rapid social change. Jakelić's analysis of modernity in the modern Balkan context is important not only for the light it sheds on the specific experiences of modernity in that context, but also for its general critique of common assumptions about the relationship between religion and secularity in the modern period in general. As Jakelić points out, theorists of modernity and religion often assume two things to be universally true: that in the modern period, religion is experienced primarily as a choice, and that the default mode of interaction between religion and secularity is a power struggle. Jakelić frames her arguments as a critique of Charles Taylor's famous, quote, subtraction story of the relationship of religion and modernity, where the advancement of a secular worldview necessarily takes something away from a religious worldview. Taylor's analysis, quote, identifies and prophesies the decline or the radical change of religion within modernity. This means that increasing secularity is a process of the conquest of religious territory. Once a concept, social practice, political system, etc., becomes secular, it is taken away from the traditional governance of the religious worldview and forcibly subjugated to a new administration. But Jakelić notes that this understanding of modernity presupposes a liberal Protestant understanding of religion that is highly, quote, idealist, individualist, and voluntarist. In other words, this reading of modernity assumes that everyone experiences religion as an identity that they can easily adopt or discard. It's an option that they have placed in front of them for adoption or rejection. Jakelić argues that religious identity in the Balkans, in stark contrast with Western Europe, is, quote, collectivistic rather than individualistic. Her use of these terms refers not to a general mindset, but rather how religious identity is experienced in these contexts. Jakelić argues that religious identity in the Balkans is characterized by the experience of never having chosen one's religious faith. One does not choose to belong to these religious traditions. One is born into them, as she puts it. And as she points out, this form of religious belonging is probably more globally common than the Western individualist model, which, despite its serving as the basis for our understanding of global modernity, is likely the exception rather than the rule to the modern relationship between religion and secularity. The liberal individualist framework interprets this kind of collectivistic religious identity as necessarily restrictive and exclusivist because it is rooted in the experience of, quote, ascription rather than conscious choice. However, Zizioulas argues that this form of religious identity can actively support both exclusive and inclusive forms of politics, even though it has often been used to justify and reinforce group boundaries, including to the point of violence. The inborn experience of religion, the given experience of religion, can alternatively serve as the foundation for the cultivation of a genuine pluralism. The shared experience of inborn religious identity can lead to, quote, a capacity for reflexivity that promotes active respect for irreducible difference, which is the very basis of successful modes of religious pluralism. As she puts it, quote, pluralism can be pluralism only if it is constituted by deep differences, only if it turns our encounter with others into an opportunity for reflexivity. In other words, the sense of difference imbued by collectivistic religious identity can be cultivated either as a form of deep repugnance and aversion or respect and appreciation of the religious other. The capacity for Orthodox Christian and Sunni Muslim religious identity in the Balkans to produce theologies that sustain genuine pluralism is the more specific subject that I will briefly explore today through the work of Zizioulas and Topaloğlu. First, why compare these two theologians at all? As explained above, they share a very similar social and political context in the Balkans, the modern Balkans. Secondly, they are exact contemporaries of one another. John Zizioulas was born in 1931, Bekir Topaloğlu was born in 1932, and departed this life in 2016. Zizioulas' career is well known, so I'll offer here a few remarks on Topaloğlu's career, which is unfortunately almost totally unknown outside of Turkey. Topaloğlu is a revered figure in Turkish theological academia. He is widely credited with laying the foundations of the study and writing of his traditional Islamic theology in the modern Turkish context, was a beloved mentor, and edited and translated some of the most important classical Sunni theological texts into Turkish. Indeed, the mere mention of his name among Turkish theologians today immediately elicits a reverent emotional reaction, especially among those who knew him personally. Though his work has never been translated out of Turkish, given how important he is to that nation's modern intellectual history, I would describe him as one of the most important religious thinkers of the 20th century. In my admittedly brief and reflective analysis of their work, what I want to argue is that both of these theologians offer the same kind of resources for a deeply authentic, traditional, and open to the other kind of religious identity that Zizioulas identifies as an ethical strength of religious identity in the Balkans. More specifically, I argue that both conceive of theology itself as, quote, this is my definition here of how they see theology, as knowledge of how God creates and sustains community in this world and the next. This is the central claim that I will explore today. A quick note on my sources. I will also be referring to sources that each of them wrote at the same time, in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it is these texts in particular that are often seen as the basic elements of their later theological work. Both theologians are renowned not only for their extraordinary command of the classical theological texts of their respective traditions, but also for how they bring the central insights of those texts to bear on contemporary social experience, most especially on the experience of being religious in a secularized, modernized context. Importantly for our purposes, both theologians identify modern social life as a potential threat to authentic community. Zizioulas critiques the post-Enlightenment individualism of the modern world, arguing that it harms the authentic experience of human personhood, which is formed by communion with others. He further contends that modern individualism harms our experience of truth itself, because all truth is grounded in God, in God's self, who is being in communion as the Trinity of divine persons. Topaloğlu critiques modern materialism because it leads to similar problems. It threatens belief in the one God, and it is this belief that is the foundation for peace, justice, and human flourishing in this world and the next. Topaloğlu is particularly critical of his own nation in this regard, which he notes was, at that time, so thoroughly secularized that its culture was even more hostile to religious belief than Western Europe. This is Turkey in the 1970s and 1980s. For both theologians, the answer to the social fragmentation of modernity is theology itself. I do not pretend to exhaust the entirety of their respective definitions or uses of theology as a whole, which are by definition inexhaustible. I will elaborate here instead how their understanding relates to the challenges of modern social life. As I said previously, they both define theology as knowledge of how God creates and sustains community in this world and the next. To take Zizioulas first, we can say in this context that Zizioulas defines theology as knowledge of how God brings creation into communion with the divine. Following Maximus the Confessor in particular, Zizioulas reads the problem of modern life through the ontological prism of the incarnation of Christ. The incarnation is the event of unchanging truth itself coming into changing history, and the accomplishing of God's will that the cosmos be brought into communion with God. Being, truth, and life itself are communal, because this is the nature of the triune God who is being, truth, and life itself. The action of bringing the cosmos into communion with God is the incarnation of the Logos, the coming into the world of the basic principle of the world's being, truth, and life. The consequence of this theological vision for community among human beings is clear. Commonly, community properly understood is not a function of nation or individuality. It is the social manifestation of the love of God that is the basis for the entirety of God's relationship with the whole world. To quote him here, truth as communion does not lead to the dissolving of the diversity of beings into one vast ocean of being, but to the affirmation of otherness in and through love. In the context of the problem of modern social life, Topaloğlu's definition of theology can be phrased this way. Theology is knowledge of how God brings creation into fulfillment and flourishing, or saadet. In the same way that Zizioulas excavates traditional Greek patristic theological concepts for use in the modern context, such as koinonia, Topaloğlu excavates traditional Sunni theological terms for the same purpose. Saadet, in modern Turkish and Ottoman, translates the Arabic saada, which refers to the complete happiness of fulfillment, or the complete experience of fulfillment or happiness, Topaloğlu breaks his definition of theology into two parts: its subject matter, its konu, and its goal, or telos gaye. The former leads to the latter, which is this ultimate fulfillment and happiness, or saadet. The subject matter of theology is the divine nature, uluhiyet, or the root of all roots, as he puts it in Islamic thought and practice. Because the truth of God's oneness, God's tawhid, is the basis of truth itself, this means that theology is the discipline within Islamic life that furnishes and grounds the basic principles of all other Islamic religious disciplines, including ritual practice, ethics, and spirituality. The truths that theology explores are the preconditions for all further elaborations of Islamic thought and practice, precisely because God's oneness, tawhid, is the basis for the full elaboration of Islam. This is why the goal of theology is the flourishing, the saadet of all creation. This is the goal of Islam itself, and the goal toward which all of Islamic thought and practice orients itself. As Topaloğlu puts it, the goal of all Islamic thought and practice is to, quote, attain saadet in this life and the next. As he explains, the truth is that this aim is exalted as far as the goal of all goals. In fact, was not Islam itself a religion sent with the goal of bringing humanity into the realm, ülke, of the saadet, of the complete fulfillment and happiness of God Most High? The term that Topaloğlu uses here for realm, ülke, is highly deliberate and revealing. This term is almost always used in modern Turkish to refer to, quote, a country, a modern nation state. But here Topaloğlu deliberately describes the harmony of communal flourishing as entering into a community based on the harmony and flourishing given by God, not by any particularly earthly kingdom or realm, recalling his strong rebuke of the violent secularism of his home country, the Turkish Republic. In other words, both of these theologians offer ways to think about communal flourishing that are not rooted in conceptions of a bounded or walled off nationalism, or a conception of religious identity that is merged with the interests of the modern state. On the contrary, both identify communal ethics as grounded in the theological insights of a specific received tradition that by participation within it opens oneself out to loving regard for the other, because community itself is grounded in the infinite care and love of God. These are the kinds of insights that I think Bekir identifies in both Orthodox Christianity and Sunni Islam in the Balkans. And I think that these insights that both of these traditions can readily recognize in one another are possible contributions to larger discussions of modernity and its shared social challenges.